Evening dreamers. Lower the mask and rest easy. No one needs saving tonight. Tonight, we drift back through the story of a laughing man in the dark and the strange, long, unlikely history of the most famous villain ever imagined. Nothing tonight will ask anything of you. You don't need to remember any names. You don't need to follow the thread. You can let every word drift past you like a comic panel dissolving softly into the next, like rain running down a dark window high above a sleeping city. And that is exactly how this is meant to be heard. Slowly, gently, with no particular place to be. And let's say something, softly, right at the start. The figure we are drifting through tonight is a frightening one in his own stories. He is chaos and cruelty and a laughter that means nothing good. But nothing frightening is going to happen here tonight. We are not going to dwell on the terrible things he does. This is a quiet place, and we will stay in it. What we are going to do instead is something gentler and, I think, more interesting. We are going to trace where this strange figure came from, how he was very nearly thrown away before he ever began, how he changed across the long decades, and why it is that human beings, for generation after generation, have kept telling stories about him. We are going to treat him the way you might treat an old myth, from a distance, with curiosity, in the warm and the safe and the dark, because that is really what he has become. A myth, a modern one. He began as a small thing, a disposable thing, a villain drawn up quickly for a story that needed one. And he grew, slowly, across almost a century, into one of the most recognizable figures on the whole planet, a face that people know in every country and every language, a figure who has been reinvented more times by more different hands than almost any character ever created. That is a strange fate for a villain who was nearly discarded in his very first appearance. And how it happened and what it means is the story we are going to drift through tonight. But there is no need to hurry toward any of it. We have all night and the whole long story to tell, and the telling of it is meant to carry you down into sleep, not to keep you here with me. So before we begin, get comfortable. Turn the lights down low or off completely. Rest your head against something soft, and if you feel like it, before you drift too far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's a gentle thing we like to imagine, all the quiet rooms this voice travels into. An apartment high above a glittering city with the traffic humming far below. A small house at the end of a long dark road. A bed by a window somewhere, with the rain coming down, or the snow, or the warm, still air of somewhere far away. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. And if these quiet stories help you find your way down into sleep, you're always welcome to follow along, so the light's still on tomorrow night and the night after that. There's no rush at all. We have all the time in the world. Let's begin. To understand this figure, you have to begin at the very beginning, in the earliest days of the whole art form he lives inside. So let's drift back, softly, to a time before almost anyone listening tonight was born, to the very first years of the great age of illustrated stories, when the whole idea of a costumed hero was brand new and nobody yet knew what the rules were. Picture the world then. The heroes in these new illustrated adventures were bright, simple, uncomplicated figures. Good and bad were clearly marked. The villains were mostly gangsters and crooked businessmen and mad scientists, straightforward obstacles for the hero to overcome, and largely forgettable, one much the same as the next. Nobody, at that time, was thinking very hard about villains. A villain was a thing you needed so that the hero would have something to do. You drew one up, the hero defeated him, and that was that. And next month, you drew up another. Villains were disposable. They were the raw material of the story, not the point of it. And into that world, Into that casual assembly line of forgettable adversaries came a strange idea. The people making these stories, a small group of young creators working fast and cheaply, needed a new villain for the masked hero they had been working on. And rather than reaching for another gangster, another crooked businessman, they reached for something stranger. They imagined a figure with a white face and a red grin. A figure who looked like a playing card come to life. A figure whose whole appearance was built around laughter and games and the eerie, fixed smile of a clown. There are various accounts of exactly where the image came from, and the people involved remembered it differently over the years, as people do. Some pointed to a playing card. Some pointed to an image from an old silent film, a figure with a face carved permanently into a grin. Some pointed simply to their own imaginations. The precise truth is tangled up now in memory and in the passage of many decades, which is, when you think about it, quietly fitting, because uncertainty about origins would turn out to be the very heart of this figure. Even his own beginning, in the real world, is a story with several versions and no final answer. But whatever the source of the image, the effect was immediate. Because a laughing, white-faced figure in bright colors was not like the other villains. He was not a gangster. He was not a mad scientist. He was something else, something that reached into a different and older part of the mind. He was uncanny. He touched that particular unease that human beings have always felt around clowns and masks and painted faces, the discomfort of a face that is fixed in an expression that does not match what lies behind it, a smile that never fades no matter what is happening. He was frightening in a way the other villains were not, because he was frightening in a way that was not about muscle or weapons or threat. He was frightening because he was wrong, because something about him did not fit, did not make sense, could not quite be placed. And that unease, that wrongness, is what set him apart from the very first moment. And here is the detail that makes the whole story delicious, and it is worth resting on, softly, in the dark. This figure, this most famous villain in the history of the form, was very nearly killed off at the end of his very first appearance. Genuinely. The plan, as the creators worked through those early stories, was to finish him, to have the hero defeat him and that be the end of it. One more disposable villain used up and discarded, exactly as they all were in those days. He was not conceived as a lasting figure. He was not designed to be an eternal adversary. He was drawn up for a story, and the story was going to end, and he was going to end with it, and everyone would move on to the next thing. And he was saved, essentially, by a second opinion. Someone in the process, someone with an editor's eye, looked at this strange, laughing figure and saw something the others had not quite seen, saw that he was too good to throw away, saw that there was something here worth keeping, something with more life in it than the usual disposable villain. And so, at the last moment, the ending was changed. The figure survived. He was left alive to return another day. And that single small decision, made quickly in the ordinary rush of producing a monthly story, is one of the great small hinges in the history of popular culture. Because if that decision had gone the other way, this figure would have appeared once, in one story, in the early 1940s, and vanished forever. A forgotten one-off villain that no one alive today would have ever heard of. Instead, he lived. And in living, He began a career that would run for the better part of a century and make him one of the most famous imaginary people who has ever existed. There is something worth sitting with in that, gently, as you drift. How much of what becomes enormous begins as something small and nearly discarded? How often the things that end up mattering most were, at the moment of their creation, casual, hurried, unremarkable, made by people with no idea what they were making. Nobody in that room knew they were creating an icon. They were producing a story on a deadline for a modest wage in a young and disreputable industry that respectable people looked down on. They were just doing their jobs. And out of that ordinary afternoon of ordinary work came a figure who would outlive every single one of them and be known, eventually, to more people than any of them could have imagined. The extraordinary so often arrives disguised as the routine. And the moment that changes everything so often looks, at the time, like nothing at all. So he lived. And having lived, he began the strangest career of any figure in this whole world of illustrated stories. Because he did not simply continue, he transformed, again and again, across the decades, so completely that the figure at one end of his history would barely recognize the figure at the other. And that long, slow transformation is one of the most interesting things about him. So let's drift through it gently. In those first years, he was frightening, genuinely so. A murderous figure who announced his crimes in advance, taunting the authorities, delighting in the game of it. He was a killer, and the stories did not pretend otherwise. But the world those stories lived in was changing, and changing fast. Because as the years passed, and these illustrated adventures became more and more popular with young people, a great wave of concern rose up in society. Exactly the kind of wave we have talked about on other nights. The old familiar cycle of adults growing frightened of what the young are enjoying. Serious people worried that these stories were corrupting children. There were books written, hearings held, campaigns launched. And the industry, frightened for its survival, did what frightened industries do. It policed itself. It adopted a strict code of rules about what could and could not appear in these stories, and those rules were very restrictive indeed. Violence was curtailed. Darkness was discouraged. Villains had to be punished. The whole art form was pushed firmly toward the safe and the sunny and the harmless. And the laughing man changed to survive it. This is one of the strangest chapters of his long life, and a gentle one, so let's rest in it a while. Because under those new rules, a murderous figure of genuine menace simply could not continue as he had been. And so he was softened, transformed, declawed. Across the 1950s and into the 60s, he became something almost entirely different from what he had begun as. He became a prankster, a trickster, a harmless, clownish nuisance who committed elaborate, silly, theatrical crimes built around jokes and gimmicks and enormous props. He was not a murderer anymore. He was a mischief maker, a figure who might steal something valuable by means of an absurd contraption, or commit a robbery themed around a bad pun, and who would be foiled at the end and sent off to jail with a wink and a laugh. He was, in those years, essentially comic, a figure of fun rather than a figure of fear. And that softened version reached its widest audience of all when the masked hero and his world came to television. In a bright, colorful, deliberately silly form that swept the world in the 1960s. That version of the Laughing Man on that show was a delight. Cackling, prancing, gleefully ridiculous, a pantomime villain in loud purple, entirely harmless, entirely fun, beloved by children everywhere. For a whole generation of people, that was who he was. Not a nightmare. A funny man in purple with a green wig who laughed a lot and always lost. It is remarkable to think about, drifting here in the dark, that the figure who would later become a byword for terrifying chaos spent a long stretch of his life as a cheerful children's entertainer, essentially, a figure of harmless delight in a sunny and silly world. There is something quietly fascinating in that transformation, and worth resting on, softly, because it shows how completely these long-running figures are shaped by the times they pass through. He did not change because his story required it. He changed because the world around him changed, because the rules changed, because what society would tolerate changed. He is a kind of mirror in that sense, reflecting back the anxieties and permissions of each era he lives through. When the world was frightened of what its children were reading, he became harmless. When the world wanted bright, silly fun, he became bright and silly. He has always been, in a way, a barometer of the culture that produces him, taking whatever shape the moment allows. And that is one of the reasons his history is so interesting to trace. To follow him across the decades is to follow the changing moods of the last 100 years, written into the changing face of a single imaginary figure. But the sunny era did not last. Nothing does. And as the years turned and the world changed again, as the restrictions loosened and audiences grew older, and the appetite for darker and more complicated stories returned, the Laughing Man changed once more. And this time, he changed back, and then further, into something darker than he had ever been at the start. Let's drift into that, softly. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the decades that followed, the creators working on these stories began to reach back toward the original menace of the character, and then to push well past it. The harmless prankster was set aside. The murderer returned, and returned amplified, deepened, made stranger and more frightening than the relatively straightforward killer of the earliest years. Because now the creators had more room and more sophistication, and a growing sense that these stories could carry real weight, real darkness, real psychological complexity. And so they turned this figure into something genuinely unsettling, not a criminal with a gimmick, but a force, a presence, a creature of pure disorder whose motives could not be understood in any ordinary way. And this is the version most people today recognize, the version that has dominated for the last several decades. So let's spend some time with what he became, gently, from a safe distance. The essential thing about him, in this later form, is that he does not want the things that villains are supposed to want. He does not want money, not really. He does not want power, not in any ordinary sense. He does not want to rule anything, or own anything, or gain anything. Those are the motives of ordinary criminals, and ordinary criminals can be understood, predicted, negotiated with, because they want things and will act rationally to get them. He is not that. What he wants, as far as anyone can tell, is simply chaos, disorder, the disruption of every pattern, the proving of a point. And that makes him fundamentally unlike any ordinary adversary, because you cannot bargain with someone who wants nothing you could give them. You cannot predict someone who has no plan beyond the spreading of unpredictability itself. He is not a criminal. He is a kind of weather, a storm that laughs. Let's linger, softly, on one more aspect of him before we go deeper, because it runs through every version of him, and it is quietly revealing. It is his relationship to games, to jokes, to the whole apparatus of play. Because everything he does is framed as a game. That is consistent across every era of his long life, from the murderous early years through the silly middle decades and into the darker modern versions. He announces things in advance. He leaves clues. He sets puzzles. He gives people choices, usually impossible ones. He treats the most serious situations imaginable as though they were entertainments, with rules and moves and a scoring system that only he understands. Even his name in his stories is the name of a card, the odd one out in the deck, the card that belongs to no suit and can stand for anything. And there is something worth understanding in that, gently, because it is not merely decoration. A game is a structure with rules, and rules are a kind of order, and you might think a figure devoted to chaos would have no use for them. But look closer. What he actually does is take the form of a game and empty it of everything that makes games good. Real games are voluntary. You choose to play, and you can stop. Real games are fair, or aim to be. Real games are separate from life, a small, bounded space where nothing that happens really counts. His games are none of those things. Nobody consents to play. Nobody can stop. The rules change whenever he likes, and the stakes are entirely real. He takes the shape of play and pours something terrible into it, which is exactly the same trick as the fixed smile and the empty laugh. Take a thing that signals safety and joy, keep the shape, remove the substance. He does it with faces, he does it with laughter, and he does it with games. There is also something in it about why he is so drawn to his opposite, and it is worth resting on softly. Because the man in the mask is the only person who takes him seriously enough to play. Everyone else in that world just wants him stopped, contained, removed. Only his great opponent engages with the puzzles, follows the clues, treats the whole thing as a contest of minds worth entering into. And for a figure whose deepest need is to be answered, that engagement must be enormously satisfying. He has, in the man in the mask, found the one person in the world who will actually play the game with him, which is perhaps why he has never wanted to end him. To win would be to lose the only opponent worth having. The game is the whole point, and a game with no opponent is not a game at all. It is just a person alone in a room, laughing at nothing. And now we come to the deepest and most interesting thing about him, the thing that separates him from almost every other figure in these stories. And it is a strange and haunting idea, so let's drift into it slowly. It is the question of where he came from, his origin. And the answer, the extraordinary answer that has become one of the defining features of his whole existence, is that nobody knows. Not the people in his stories, not the readers, not even, apparently, the man himself. This is genuinely unusual. Think about how these stories normally work. Almost every major figure in them has an origin, a clear and fixed and endlessly retold account of how they became what they are. the boy in the alley who lost his parents, the young man bitten by an altered creature who learned what power costs. These origins are the foundations of the characters, the thing that explains them, the fixed point from which everything else follows. They are told and retold, generation after generation, essentially unchanged, because they are the heart of who these figures are. To know the origin is to understand the character. But not for him. For him, there is no fixed origin, and this appears to be entirely deliberate. The most influential account of his beginnings, the one that has shaped how people think of him for decades, offers a story of an ordinary man having the worst day of his life, a cascade of misfortune and loss and desperation ending in a terrible accident with chemicals that bleached his skin and fixed his face into a permanent grin, and in the shock and horror of it all, broke his mind entirely. It is a sad story, and a sympathetic one, and it makes him almost pitiable. But even that account, in the telling, undercuts itself, because in that very story, he acknowledges that he is not certain it is true, that he remembers his past differently at different times, that if he is going to have had a past, he would prefer it to be multiple choice. Let's sit with that phrase for a moment, softly, because it is one of the most quietly unnerving ideas in all of these stories. Multiple choice. He does not have one past. He has several, and they contradict each other, and he cannot tell which is real, and he does not particularly care. Every other figure in his world is anchored to a fixed and known history. He floats free of his. He has no foundation, no fixed point, no single moment that made him. He is a person without a past, or rather, a person with too many pasts, none of them certain, all of them possible. And this is not a gap in his story. It is the point of his story. It is worth understanding why, gently, because it is genuinely clever. Consider the man in the mask, his great opposite, whom we have drifted through on another night. That man is defined absolutely by his past. One night, one alley, one terrible loss, and everything he has ever done since flows from it. He is anchored to his history so completely that his entire identity is built on it. He is a person made of memory, made of grief, made of one fixed, unchangeable moment that he has spent his whole life responding to. He knows exactly who he is and exactly why, and that knowledge is the spine of him. And the laughing man is the opposite of that in every possible way. Where the other is anchored, he drifts. Where the other is defined by memory, he has no reliable memory at all. Where the other has one fixed moment that made him, he has a handful of contradictory ones and no way to choose between them. He is unmoored, free-floating, a person with no foundation, and therefore a person who cannot be understood the way we understand other people. Because understanding a person usually means understanding where they came from and what happened to them. You cannot do that with him. There is nothing there to hold on to. And that absence, that hollow where an origin should be, is far more frightening than any origin could ever be. Because a monster with a known origin is comprehensible. It has a cause. It can be reasoned about, and perhaps even prevented, and certainly pitied. A monster with no origin at all is something else. It simply is. It arrived from nowhere, for no reason, and it cannot be explained or accounted for or reasoned away. There is something almost philosophical in this, and worth turning over softly as you drift, because human beings have a deep, almost desperate need to explain things. When something terrible happens, we ask why. We look for causes. We build explanations, because an explained thing is a manageable thing, and an unexplained thing sits in the mind like a splinter. We do this with real horrors, always. We ask what made a person do a terrible thing, and we search their history for the wound that explains it. Because if we can find the wound, we can tell ourselves we understand. And if we understand, we are a little safer, because understood things can be guarded against. This figure denies us that comfort entirely. He refuses the explanation. He will not give us the wound that makes sense of him. And in refusing, he embodies something that frightens people very deeply, which is the possibility that some things simply have no explanation, that some chaos arrives without cause, that the universe is not always tidy enough to give us a reason for everything that happens in it. That, I think, is the deepest source of his power as a figure, and it is why he has endured for so long when so many other villains have faded. He is not frightening because of what he does. Plenty of imaginary villains do terrible things. He is frightening because he cannot be explained, and human beings find inexplicability genuinely disturbing at a level far below conscious thought. He is a hole in the story where a reason should be. And every time a new telling tries to fill that hole, to finally explain him, to give him a definitive past, something is lost. Because the emptiness was the point. He works best as an unanswered question. And so the storytellers, the good ones, keep leaving him unanswered, keep resisting the temptation to explain, keep him floating free of any fixed past. Which means that after nearly a century of stories, one of the most famous figures in the world remains, at his center, entirely unknown. Nobody knows who he was. Perhaps nobody ever did. Perhaps there was never anyone there at all. Let's drift now into the relationship that defines him more than anything else, softly, because it is one of the strangest and most enduring pairings in all of storytelling, and there is a great deal in it worth resting on. It is his endless entanglement with the man in the mask, the grim, silent, disciplined figure who has spent his whole life imposing order on a chaotic city. They have been circling each other for the better part of a century now, these two, and they are bound together so tightly that it has become impossible to think of one without the other, because they are opposites in a way that is almost too neat, almost like something designed rather than something that happened. The man in the mask is order, control, discipline. He is a person who took the worst thing that ever happened to him and forced it into a rigid, unbreakable shape, who built his entire self around a promise, who imposes structure on everything he touches because structure is the only way he has ever found to survive his grief. He is silent. He is serious. He plans everything. He never laughs. And the laughing man is chaos, disorder, the absence of all structure. He is a person with no plan, no rules, no fixed self, no past he can rely on, no goal beyond the disruption of goals. He is loud. He is theatrical. He improvises everything. He never stops laughing. Where the other is anchored, he drifts. Where the other imposes meaning, he denies that meaning exists. They are, in almost every dimension, exact inversions of one another. Two answers to the same terrible question, pointing in opposite directions. And that question, the one they are both answering, is the thing that binds them. And it is worth stating gently because it is the true heart of their whole endless dance. The question is this: what does a person do when something terrible happens to them? Both of these figures, in most tellings, are people who were broken by something. The man in the mask lost his family in an alley. The laughing man, in whichever version of his past you choose to believe, suffered some catastrophe that shattered him. Both were handed a great darkness, and they answered it in opposite ways. One took his suffering and built something out of it, turned it into discipline and purpose and a lifetime of protecting others. The other took his suffering and let it dissolve him, turned it into the conviction that nothing means anything, and the only honest response is laughter. Same wound, opposite answers. And their endless conflict is really an argument about which answer is right. That is why the laughing man is so fixated on his opposite, and it is worth resting on, softly, because he does not want to defeat the man in the mask in any ordinary sense. He does not want to kill him. He does not want to win, not in the way villains usually want to win, because winning would end the argument. And the argument is the whole point. What he wants is to prove himself right. He wants to demonstrate that the man in the mask, this paragon of discipline and order and moral rigidity, is fundamentally no different from him, that his order is a fiction, that his rules are a pose, and that with sufficient pressure, with one sufficiently bad day, he would crack and become exactly what the laughing man already is. That is his true goal, not destruction, vindication. He wants to be told he is right about the world, and the man in the mask, in refusing to break, in holding his line year after year, no matter what is done to him, is offering the only rebuttal he can. Not an argument, because you cannot argue with someone who does not believe in reason. Just an example, a refusal, a life lived in demonstration of the opposite thesis. Every night that he goes out and protects someone instead of surrendering to despair, he is answering the laughing man's question with his whole existence. No, you are not right about people. You are not right about me. Meaning is not a fiction. And that quiet, endless, wordless rebuttal is the only weapon that works against a figure who cannot be defeated by force. There is one more thing that binds them, and it is the saddest and most beautiful part of the whole arrangement, so let's rest in it a while. The man in the mask will not kill him. He has one absolute rule, the line he will never cross, and because he holds that line, his opposite lives. Again and again, captured and confined and inevitably escaping forever. The man in the mask could end their war permanently, in a moment, if he were willing to become, just once, the thing he has sworn never to be. And he will not. He would rather bear the burden forever than break his one rule, which means his mercy is the very thing that guarantees his suffering will never end. He keeps his enemy alive at unimaginable cost, and the cost is paid over and over, and he pays it anyway, because to stop paying it would be to lose himself. And the laughing man knows this. That is the exquisite cruelty of the arrangement. He knows he is safe. He knows that the one person capable of ending him has made a promise that prevents it. He is protected by his enemy's goodness, sheltered by the very principle he spends his life trying to disprove. And there is something almost unbearably ironic in that, and something almost tender underneath the irony. Because in a strange way, the man in the mask is the only person in the world who will not destroy him. Everyone else would. Everyone else, given the chance, would end him without hesitation. Only his greatest enemy insists on keeping him alive. It is a kind of care, twisted almost beyond recognition, but a kind of care nonetheless. And the two of them are locked together in it forever, the one who cannot stop and the one who will not finish it, dancing the same dance in the dark, year after year, decade after decade, neither able to release the other, both defined entirely by the other's existence. We have come a long way already, you and I. That is worth noticing, softly, before we go on. We started tonight in a small, crowded room in the early 1940s, with a hurried group of young creators drawing up a disposable villain who was very nearly killed off in his first appearance, and we have followed him through the decades of his softening and his silliness and his return to darkness, through the strange hollow where his origin should be, all the way into the endless dance with his opposite. If you are still here with me, drifting somewhere on the soft edge of sleep, there is no need to hold on to any of it. The details will keep. What matters is the slow, warm current of the story in the dark, and that will carry you just fine whether you remember a single thing or not. So let your grip loosen a little more, if it hasn't already. Sink a little deeper into the warm. We are about halfway along the road tonight, and the gentlest part of the journey is still ahead. Let's carry on, slowly, together. Let's drift, softly, into the long shadow he has cast over storytelling generally, because it reaches a great deal further than the city he lives in, and it is a curious thing to trace. Before him, and for a long while after him, villains in popular stories were mostly simple. They wanted things: money, power, territory, revenge. They had plans, and the plans made sense, and the hero's job was to work out the plan and stop it. That is a perfectly good structure for a story, and it has served for thousands of years. But it has a ceiling. A villain who wants something can always be understood, and once understood, defeated, and once defeated, finished. There is a limit to how deeply such a figure can disturb. What he introduced, and what took several decades to fully emerge, was a different kind of adversary altogether. One who wants nothing you can name. One whose plan, if there is one, is not the point. One who cannot be bargained with because there is nothing to bargain over, cannot be predicted because there is no logic to extrapolate, cannot be finished because there is no goal whose achievement or denial would end him. He is not an obstacle, he is a condition. And once that idea existed, once storytellers saw that an antagonist could work this way, it spread. You can see the influence in an enormous range of stories that have nothing to do with costumed heroes at all. The unknowable adversary, the one with no motive, the one who exists to unsettle rather than to obtain, has become one of the standard shapes in modern storytelling, and a great many of the figures who use it descend, directly or indirectly, from a laughing man in a purple coat who was nearly discarded in 1940. That is a considerable legacy for a disposable villain. There is something worth noticing in that, gently, as you drift, because it is how influence usually works. The figures who change an art form are rarely recognized as important at the time. Nobody in that room knew they were inventing a new category of villain. They were solving a small practical problem, filling a slot in a monthly story, doing their jobs. And the thing they made turned out to contain an idea powerful enough to reshape storytelling for the next 100 years, an idea that spread out from him into 1,000 other stories made by people who may never have thought about where the shape came from. That is what real influence looks like. Not fanfare, just an idea, quietly getting loose and going everywhere. Let's drift, now, into the many faces he has worn, softly, because this is one of the most remarkable things about his long life. Because he has been played and drawn and reimagined by a truly extraordinary number of different hands over the decades, and each one has brought something different, and the sum of all of them is a figure who contains multitudes, who can be almost anything, who reinvents himself completely every time a new teller takes him up. There have been versions built on pure theatrical delight, all cackling and grand gestures and gleeful pantomime villainy, figures who were fun to watch precisely because they were having such an obviously enormous time. There have been versions built on menace, quiet and controlled and genuinely frightening, figures who barely raised their voices and were all the more disturbing for it. There have been versions built on chaos as philosophy, figures who articulated their disorder as a kind of argument, who explained themselves at length and made a horrible sort of sense. There have been versions built on sadness, on pity, on the tragedy of a broken person, figures who made you ache for whoever they had been before. There have been versions that were mostly grotesque, versions that were mostly funny, versions that were mostly frightening, versions that somehow managed to be all three at once. And in animation, in the great animated tellings of these stories, there have been performances that many people consider definitive, voices that captured something essential, that found the exact balance between the comic and the horrifying, that could shift from delighted giggling to something ice-cold in the space of a syllable. There is a particular skill in that, in playing a figure who must be genuinely funny and genuinely frightening at the same time. And the performers who have managed it are remembered with real reverence by the people who love these stories. What is striking, drifting above all these versions, is how little they resemble each other and how completely each one works. Put them side by side, and you would hardly think they were meant to be the same figure. Different voices, different faces, different philosophies, different explanations, different tones entirely. And yet each one is unmistakably him. Which tells you something important about what he actually is. He is not a person in the way that most characters are people. He is a role, a shape, a set of ideas that anyone can pour themselves into. A white face and a red grin and a laugh and an absence where the reasons should be. Fill that shape with whatever you like and it works. And that infinite flexibility, that capacity to be reinvented completely by every new teller, is a large part of why he has lasted so long. He never gets stale because he never stays the same. Every generation makes their own, and every one of them is valid, and none of them is final. There is a lovely thought hidden in that, and worth resting on softly, that he belongs to no one and to everyone, that there is no authoritative version, no definitive telling, no single correct interpretation, that all the others are merely approximating. He is a myth in the truest sense, and myths do not have official versions. They have tellings, countless tellings, by countless tellers, each one shaped by the moment and the hands that made it, all of them true, none of them final. The old stories worked this way, the ones that were passed around fires and retold for centuries before anyone thought to write them down. Every teller changed them, every telling was different, and the story survived precisely because it could change, because it was flexible enough to be remade for each new audience in each new age. He is one of those, a modern figure who has slipped into an ancient pattern, and he will keep being retold by hands not yet born in ways we cannot imagine for as long as people find him useful, which, given what he represents, is likely to be a very long time. Let's drift, now, into the deepest question of the whole night, softly, and it is a gentle and a curious one rather than a frightening one. It is this: why do we do it? Why do human beings, generation after generation, keep telling stories about a figure like this? Why has a laughing man who represents pure disorder become one of the most famous imaginary people on the planet? What is he for? Because he must be for something. Nothing lasts this long in the shared imagination of billions of people unless it is doing some work, unless it is meeting some need. Forgettable things are forgotten, and quickly. He has not been forgotten. He has grown, decade after decade, more famous rather than less, which means he is answering something in us. And I think, drifting here in the quiet, that the answer is quite old and quite human, and not frightening at all once you look at it properly. He belongs, I think, to a very old family of figures, because human beings have always told stories about tricksters. Every culture, all over the world, going back as far as we have records, has had them. Figures who break the rules, upend the order, laugh at the serious, delight in disruption. Some are gods, some are animals, some are spirits, some are simply strange men who wander into a village and turn everything upside down. They are mischievous, sometimes cruel, always unpredictable. They exist to disturb whatever is settled, and they appear, in one form or another, in almost every mythology human beings have ever built. And they persist because they serve a genuine purpose in the imaginative life of a people. Because every society builds order, rules, structures, hierarchies, the vast invisible architecture of how things are supposed to be. And that order is necessary and mostly good, and we could not live without it. But it is also, always, a little bit of a fiction. It is something we made, not something that was given, and a part of us knows that, quietly, always. A part of us can see the arbitrariness in the rules, the accident in the hierarchy, the fragility of the whole arrangement, and that knowledge needs somewhere to go. So we invent figures who say it out loud, who point at the order and laugh, who demonstrate, safely, inside a story, that the whole structure could be knocked over, that none of it is as solid as it pretends to be. And in letting those figures exist in our stories, we let that uncomfortable knowledge exist too, and having somewhere to put it, we can go on living inside the order without being troubled by it. That is what he is for, I think. He is a trickster, the newest member of a very old family. He exists so that we can look, from a safe distance, at the possibility of meaninglessness, at the fragility of order, at the terrible thought that the universe might not be as tidy or as reasonable as we need it to be. He says the unsayable thing, and because he says it inside a story, where nobody is actually harmed and nothing is actually at stake, we can hear it and feel the shiver of it, and then close the book or turn off the screen and return to our lives with the thought safely contained. He is a pressure valve, a way of touching a frightening idea without being burned by it. And there is something else, gentler and more hopeful, and it is worth resting on softly as the night deepens. Because notice what always happens in his stories. He never wins. Not really. Not permanently. He makes his argument, again and again, that order is a fiction, and everyone is one bad day from madness, and nothing means anything. And every single time, something answers him. The man in the mask refuses to break. Someone holds the line. Somebody, somewhere in the story, demonstrates that his thesis is wrong by simply refusing to prove it right. And that is the actual shape of these stories, underneath all the chaos. They are not stories about chaos triumphing. They are stories about chaos being answered, about the argument being made in its strongest possible form by its most persuasive possible advocate, and being defeated anyway, not by force, but by someone quietly declining to accept it. That is why these stories comfort people, strange as it sounds to say about a figure so frightening. We put the darkest possible idea into the mouth of the most compelling possible speaker. We let him make his case with everything he has, and then we watch someone refuse it. Over and over, for nearly a century. It is a ritual, really, a rehearsal. We are practicing again and again the act of hearing the worst thing that could be true about the world and choosing not to believe it. And every time the story ends with the line held, with the man in the mask still standing, still refusing, still going out the next night to protect someone, we get to feel, for a moment, that the answer is possible. That meaning can survive the argument against it. That the laughing man, for all his persuasiveness, is wrong. So he is not, in the end, a story about darkness winning. He is a story about darkness being faced and answered and outlasted, which is a rather comforting thing to have at the center of a myth when you look at it clearly. He is the question. The other one is the answer. And we keep telling the story because we need to keep hearing the answer, night after night, generation after generation, for as long as the question keeps occurring to us. Which is to say, forever. There is one more thread worth following before we move on, softly, and it is a sadder and more human one. It concerns the people who are drawn into his orbit and what happens to them. Because for a figure so entirely alone, so incapable of anything resembling ordinary connection, he has a strange gravitational pull on other people. Across the decades of his stories, various figures have attached themselves to him. Followers, assistants, people who fell under his influence and stayed there. And their stories are, almost without exception, sad ones, and they are worth resting on gently because they say something true about a certain kind of relationship. The most developed of these, and the most beloved by readers, is a figure who began as a bright, capable, well-educated young woman with a promising career, who encountered him in a professional capacity and was, over time, drawn in. Not by force. That is the terrible part. She was drawn in by persuasion, by charm, by the flattering attention of someone who made her feel chosen and special, by a slow and patient reshaping of how she saw the world until she could no longer see clearly at all. And she gave up everything for him. Her career, her name, her judgment, her friends, her whole former life. She reinvented herself entirely around him, in a costume and a persona of his image, and devoted herself completely to a person who was entirely incapable of caring about her in return. And the stories, particularly the better modern ones, are quite clear-eyed about what that is. It is not a romance, whatever it might look like from outside. It is a pattern that a great many people would recognize with a sinking feeling. The charming person who isolates you from everyone else, who makes you feel that only they truly understand you, who is warm when you comply and cold when you do not, until you have rebuilt your entire self around keeping them happy and cannot remember who you were before. Her story became, over the decades, one of the most quietly serious things in this whole corner of storytelling, precisely because so many readers recognized it. And what makes it genuinely moving, worth resting on softly, is what came after. Because over time, in telling after telling, she began to get out. Slowly, with difficulty, not in a single dramatic escape, but the way people actually do get out of such things, in stages, with relapses, with help from other people who cared about her. And she became, eventually, something quite different, a figure with her own life, her own friendships, her own purposes, defined no longer by him at all. That arc, from captivity to freedom, told and retold across many hands and many years, has meant a great deal to a great many readers, for reasons that have nothing to do with costumes or crime. There is a gentle thought in that, and a hopeful one, and a good one to carry as the night deepens. That people do get out, that the pattern, however deep it runs, is not permanent, that someone who has rebuilt their whole self around another person can, with time and help and enormous effort, rebuild it again around themselves. It is one of the quietly kind things these stories have done, to tell that particular tale so many times, so patiently, until it landed. And it says something about the Laughing Man, that the most important relationship in his stories, the one readers care about most, is ultimately the story of somebody escaping him. Let's drift now back down into the world he lives in, softly, because the city that produced him is worth a gentle wander, and because he does not exist there alone. The great dark city we visited on another night, the rain-soaked Gothic place of gargoyles and low clouds and endless troubled night, is his home as much as it is his opposite's, and it is a city that produces, with terrible reliability, broken people. We have talked about this before, softly. Something in that place breeds strangeness. It takes ordinary people and, through poverty or cruelty or accident or grief, twists them into figures who move through its shadows in painted faces and strange costumes, each one a walking wound, each one the product of some catastrophe the city inflicted on them. And so, around the Laughing Man, there gathers a whole gallery of others. There is the man consumed by riddles, so desperate to be recognized as the cleverest person in the room that he cannot stop leaving clues to his own crimes. There is the one obsessed with duality, once a good man, once a figure of justice, until violence scarred him and broke something in his mind, and left him unable to choose anything without the flip of a coin. There is the one who weaponized fear itself, and the one frozen in perpetual winter around the memory of a lost love, and the one driven underground and building a kingdom out of the city's rejection of him. Each one broken differently, each one the city's fault in some way, each one a person who was handed pain and could not carry it. And in that whole gallery of the broken, he stands apart, and it is worth understanding why, gently. Because all the others can be explained. Every one of them has a wound you can point to, a cause, a story that makes sense of what they became. The Riddler wants recognition because he was overlooked. The man of two faces cannot choose because his faith in choosing was destroyed. The frozen man cannot feel warmth because he lost the only warmth he had. Their damage has a logic to it. Follow the wound and you arrive at the behavior. They are tragedies, and tragedies can be understood. He cannot. That is the difference. There is no wound to follow because there is no reliable past. He is the one figure in that whole gallery who resists explanation entirely, and that is what makes him the apex of them. The one the others are all somehow lesser versions of. They are broken people. He is something that arrived already broken, or perhaps was never whole to begin with, or perhaps, most unsettling of all, is not broken at all, but is simply seeing clearly something the rest of them cannot bear to look at. You can pity the others. Pity requires understanding, and understanding requires a story, and they all have stories. He offers nothing to pity, because he offers nothing to understand. Let's rest here for a moment, softly, in the sadness of that whole broken city, because it is a strangely gentle sorrow. All those damaged people in their painted faces, moving through the rain, each one carrying some pain they could not put down, each one having answered their suffering by becoming something monstrous, and moving among them, the one figure who protects the city from all of them, who was handed exactly the same kind of pain and answered it the other way. That is the shape of the whole thing. A city full of people broken by grief, and one man broken by grief who chose, every single day, to protect rather than to harm. The line between them is so thin, it is only a choice, just a choice, made over and over, in the dark, by someone who could very easily have gone the other way. And there is something quietly moving in the fact that the man in the mask knows this, that when he faces these broken figures, he does not face them with hatred. He faces them with a sorrowful recognition, because he sees in every one of them a road he might have walked. He is not fighting monsters. He is fighting the people he might have been. And every time he stops one of them and delivers them to whatever care or confinement awaits, there is something almost mournful in it, an act less like victory than like the sad, necessary containment of a person who could not be saved. That sorrow, running underneath all the spectacle, is one of the things that gives these stories their unexpected depth. They are, so often, not really about good defeating evil. They are about one wounded person restraining other wounded people, gently as he can, because someone has to, and because he understands them better than anyone alive. Let's drift, now, into something smaller and stranger, softly, and dwell for a while on the pure design of him, the look and the sound, because it is worth asking why this particular image, out of all the images ever invented for villains, has proven so unshakable. Start with the face. A white face, a red mouth, green hair. It is, when you describe it plainly, a clown. And clowns are supposed to be delightful. They are figures of children's parties and circuses, painted up to be funny, existing to make people laugh. And yet a great many people find them unsettling, and always have, and that unease is very old and quite universal, and worth understanding gently. The reason, most likely, is the fixedness. A human face is the most important thing most of us ever look at. We read faces constantly, automatically, from infancy, gathering enormous amounts of information from the smallest movements around the eyes and the mouth. It is one of the deepest skills we have, and a painted face defeats it entirely. The paint fixes an expression permanently in place so that the face is always smiling no matter what the person behind it feels. And that creates a wrongness that the mind cannot resolve. You are looking at a face that is telling you one thing while something quite different might be happening underneath, and you have no way to check. The instrument you rely on to read other people has been disabled. And so a part of you, quite far below conscious thought, becomes uneasy. Now take that unease and build a figure entirely out of it. That is what he is. Not a clown who happens to be frightening, but a figure who takes the specific, quiet wrongness of a painted smile and makes it his whole self. And crucially, in most tellings, his smile is not paint at all. It is permanent. It is his actual face, chemically fixed into a grin he cannot remove even if he wanted to. Which means there is no removing the mask, no moment where the paint comes off and the real person appears underneath. The smile goes all the way down. And that closes the last escape hatch the mind was reaching for. The comforting thought that behind the disturbing face there is an ordinary person. There isn't. There is only more of the same. And then there is the laugh. It is worth resting on softly because it might be the single most important element of the whole design. Laughter is one of the warmest sounds human beings make. It is the sound of delight, of connection, of shared joy, of a group of people feeling good together. We are drawn to it. When we hear laughter, some part of us relaxes and wants to join in. It is one of the oldest signals of safety we have. And he takes that sound and empties it out. He laughs constantly, and it means none of the things laughter is supposed to mean. It is not shared. It is not warm. It is not an invitation. It is the sound of delight attached to things that ought to horrify. Joy in the wrong place. The warmest sound in the human repertoire turned entirely cold. And there is something deeply unsettling in that inversion, in hearing the sound of happiness where happiness has no business being. It is the same wrongness as the fixed smile, but in sound rather than image. A signal of safety corrupted into a signal of danger, which means that the entire design of him, face and voice together, is built from a single idea, executed with real elegance. Take the things that signal warmth and safety and joy and hollow them out. A smile that means nothing. A laugh that means nothing. Bright, cheerful colors on a figure who is anything but. He is joy with the joy removed, and that emptiness at the center of something that should be full is the source of all his unease. It is genuinely clever design, whether the people who arrived at it in that hurried room in the 1940s fully understood what they were doing or not. They found, perhaps half by accident, an image that reaches into a very deep and very old part of the human mind, and it has held its grip there ever since. There is a comfort in understanding it, though, and worth resting on as you drift. Because once you can see the machinery, once you can name why the image works, it loses a little of its power to disturb and becomes instead a thing to admire. It is craft, clever craft, arrived at by working artists doing their jobs, refined by many hands across many decades until it reached the elegant, frightening thing it is now. And like all craft, it can be looked at calmly, taken apart, understood, appreciated. He is a very well-made image. That is all. a very well-made image, made by people, for stories, and now sitting harmlessly in the shared imagination of the world, doing exactly the job it was built to do. Let's drift now into a question that people who love these stories have argued about gently for decades, softly, because it is an interesting one and it has no settled answer. It is the question of whether he should ever be explained at all, because there is a real tension here, and it runs through the whole history of his tellings. On one side, there is the instinct to explain. Storytellers are drawn, almost irresistibly, to origins. It is a natural impulse. When you have a figure this compelling, you want to know where he came from, and you want to show your audience. And there is real dramatic power in taking a monster and revealing the human being who used to live inside him. Some of the most admired tellings of his story have done exactly that, offering an account of an ordinary man on the worst day of his life, and finding real tragedy in it, real pity, real sorrow for whoever he was before. Those tellings can be genuinely moving. They turn a nightmare into a casualty. They make you sad for him. And on the other side, there is the argument that every explanation diminishes him. That the moment you show the man behind the laughing figure, you have made him comprehensible. And comprehensible is exactly what he must never be. That his power lives entirely in the hollow where his reasons should be. And filling that hollow, however skillfully, drains him. By this argument, the best version of him is always the least explained one, the one who arrives from nowhere, with no history and no motive that can be named, because that is the only version that does the particular work he exists to do. Both arguments are good, which is why the debate has never been settled and probably never will be. And what has actually happened across the long decades is a kind of oscillation. Some tellings explain him, others deliberately refuse. And because there is no authoritative version, both kinds coexist, and the audience is left holding several contradictory possibilities at once, which is, when you think about it, exactly the multiple choice condition he describes for himself. The disagreement among storytellers has produced, in the end, the very ambiguity that suits him best. His creators, arguing about whether he should have a past, have collectively ensured that he does not have a settled one. The argument itself has become the answer. There is a related question, gentler and more interesting, and worth resting on softly. It is the question of sympathy. Because in recent decades there has been a real appetite for versions of him that invite pity, that frame him as a victim, that trace his condition to cruelty and neglect and a society that failed him. And that impulse comes from a good place, mostly. It comes from a genuine and humane instinct to understand rather than simply condemn, to look for the causes of harm rather than treating harmful people as inexplicably evil. That instinct is worth having. It makes for more humane stories and, in the real world, for more humane thinking. But there is a delicate balance in it, and the best tellers have always known this. Because sympathy for a figure like this can shade, if handled carelessly, into something else. Into excuse. Into a story that seems to say that the harm was justified, or inevitable, or the fault of everyone except the person who caused it. And that is a very different thing from understanding. The tellings that manage it best are the ones that hold both truths at once, without letting either cancel the other. Yes, something terrible happened to him, and yes, he chose what he did with it. Both, neither one erasing the other. Understanding without absolution, compassion without excuse. And that balance, when a telling achieves it, is where the real depth of these stories lives, and it is worth carrying with you gently as you drift, because it is the same balance we have to strike in the actual world, constantly, with real people. The knowledge that people who cause harm have almost always been harmed themselves, and the equally important knowledge that this explains their actions without justifying them. Holding those two things together is difficult. It is much easier to collapse into one or the other, into pure condemnation or pure excuse. But the truth lives in the tension between them, and stories that can hold that tension teach us something genuinely useful about how to think about the broken and dangerous people we share the world with. Which is, perhaps, one more reason these stories have lasted. Underneath the costumes and the spectacle, they are working through questions that we actually face. What do we owe to people who have been damaged? How much does a wound explain? Where does understanding end and excuse begin? Nobody has final answers to those questions, and the stories do not pretend to. They just keep circling them, telling and retelling, letting each generation work through them in their own way. And a figure with no fixed origin turns out to be the perfect place to hold a question with no fixed answer. Let's drift, now, out of the stories themselves and into the wider world, softly, because one of the strangest things about this figure is how far he has traveled beyond the pages he began in, and how enormous he has become. Consider the scale of it. He began, as we said, as a disposable villain in a cheap monthly publication in the early 1940s, in an industry that respectable people looked down on, made by young men working fast for modest wages. And he is now one of the most recognizable images on the entire planet. His face is known in countries where his stories have never been widely published, to people who have never read a single one of them, in every language on earth. He has appeared in films seen by hundreds of millions. He has been the subject of performances that won the highest honors the film world can give, which is a genuinely remarkable thing when you consider that he began as a throwaway antagonist in a children's adventure serial. He appears on clothing, on walls, in graffiti in cities all over the world. He has become, entirely without anyone planning it, a piece of the common visual language of humanity. That is an extraordinary journey for any imaginary figure, and it is worth resting on softly, because it says something about how culture actually works. Nobody decided this would happen. There was no plan. The people who made him had no idea. It happened the way these things always happen, by accumulation, by countless small choices made by countless people over many decades, each one adding a little, until one day the thing had become enormous, and everyone simply took it for granted that it always had been. Fame of this kind is never engineered. It accretes, and the figures who achieve it are almost never the ones anyone expected. And there is something curious about the fact that this particular figure achieved it, worth turning over gently. Because he is a villain. Not an anti-hero, not a misunderstood outsider, not a rogue with a heart of gold. A villain, straightforwardly, who does terrible things for no good reason. And yet he is beloved. People adore him. They choose him as their favorite. They wear his face. They quote him. They line up to see the newest interpretation. There is genuine affection there, widespread and sincere, for a figure who, within his own stories, is nothing but a source of suffering. What is that about? It is worth thinking through, softly, because the answer is not troubling once you look at it. People do not love him because they approve of what he does. Nobody watching these stories wishes real harm on anyone. The affection is for something else. It is for the performance, for the theatricality, for the sheer inventive delight of a figure who is completely, gloriously unconstrained, who says whatever he likes and does whatever he likes and answers to nothing and no one. Within the safe walls of a story, that unconstraint is thrilling to watch. It is the same reason audiences have always loved the great stage villains, the schemers and the tyrants who get the best speeches and steal every scene they are in. Villains are fun to watch precisely because they are free of the rules that bind everyone else, including the audience. Watching them is a holiday from constraint. And the more completely unconstrained the villain, the more purely enjoyable the holiday. He is the most unconstrained villain ever devised, so he is, in a sense, the most enjoyable. And there is something quite healthy in that, rather than anything worrying, and it is a good thought to rest on as the night grows late. Because the appetite for watching chaos safely contained inside a story is one of the oldest and most harmless appetites we have. It has been fed by every culture in every age, by tricksters and demons and stage villains and monsters in the dark. It does not make people worse. If anything, it is one of the ways people stay well, by giving the wilder and less respectable parts of the imagination somewhere legitimate to go. We watch the laughing man break every rule, and we feel the thrill of it. And then the story ends, and we put the thrill down and go and be perfectly ordinary, decent people, exactly as we were before. The chaos stays in the box. That is what the box is for. So his enormous fame is not, I think, a sign of anything dark about the world. It is a sign of something rather ordinary and rather old. People like villains. People have always liked villains. And when a villain is designed as well as this one, with an image that reaches so deep and a philosophy so complete and a flexibility that lets every generation remake him in their own image, then people will keep liking him for a very long time. He is not popular because the world is sick. He is popular because he is extremely well made, and because he does a job that human imaginations have wanted done since long before anyone thought to draw him. Let's drift, now, into one of the strangest structural facts about his existence. Softly, because it is peculiar when you look at it directly, and there is something almost restful in its endlessness. It is the fact that he always comes back. Consider the pattern. In story after story, across decade after decade, the same shape repeats. He appears. He causes chaos. He is stopped, eventually, by the man in the mask. He is taken away and confined in the great grim institution on the edge of the city where the broken people of that place are kept. And then, some time later, he is out again, and it begins once more. He has been confined and has escaped more times than anyone could reasonably count. The pattern is so established that it has stopped being a plot point and becomes simply a condition of the world, like weather. He is out, or he is about to be out. There is no permanent version of him being contained. Now, in one sense, this is just the practical reality of serialized storytelling. Popular figures cannot be permanently removed because they are needed again next month, and next year, and in the next telling by the next set of hands. That is simply how these long-running stories work. But something more interesting has happened over the decades, because the storytellers began to notice this pattern and to make it mean something. and what it came to mean is genuinely thoughtful. So let's rest in it a while. Because the endless escape is, in the world of the story, a real and terrible problem, and the characters in that world know it. Every time he is confined and escapes, harm follows. And so the question arises again and again, and it is the great uncomfortable question at the center of these stories. Why does the man in the mask keep putting him back in a place he always leaves? Why continue a cycle that so obviously fails? Every argument says it should be ended, and the answer is always the same. Because the alternative would require the man in the mask to become something he has sworn never to be. And so the cycle continues, forever, at enormous cost, because the one person capable of ending it has decided that some prices are not worth paying even for peace. There is something almost sacred in that stubbornness, and it is worth sitting with softly here in the dark. It is a very old idea in a very new costume. The idea that there are lines you hold not because holding them produces the best outcome, but simply because they are lines, and because a person who abandons their lines when the cost gets high enough never really had them at all. The man in the mask is not holding his rule because it works. By any practical measure, it does not work. He is holding it because it is his, because it is the thing that separates him from what he fights. Because the moment he sets it down, he becomes something else. And so he pays, and pays, and pays, forever, and never sets it down. And this gives the endless cycle a different quality than mere repetition. It becomes a kind of vigil, a thing done over and over, not because it will ever be finished, but because the doing of it is itself the point. He is not failing to solve a problem. He is choosing, again and again, a solution he can live with over a solution that would work. There is something almost devotional in it, the way a person might keep a promise to someone long dead, not because the promise accomplishes anything, but because keeping it is who they have decided to be. Let's rest in that a moment, softly, because there is a strange peace in it as the night deepens. The endlessness stops being frustrating once you see it properly. Yes, the laughing man will always come back. Yes, the cycle will never close. And yes, the man in the mask will be there each time, standing in the same place, holding the same line, refusing the same easy answer he has refused 1,000 times before. It is not a story that is going anywhere. It is a story about someone staying somewhere, about the willingness to keep showing up for something that will never be finished. And that, when you think about it, is closer to how most real good gets done than any story about final victories. Nobody ever finishes. The work just goes on, and the question is only whether someone is still there doing it. And there is something soothing in the permanence of that, in the certainty that whatever happens, the arrangement holds. He escapes. The man in the mask is there. He escapes again. The man in the mask is there again. Forever, in a fictional city under a permanent reign, two figures endlessly repeating their argument, neither ever winning, neither ever leaving. It has the quality of a very old story, a thing carved in stone somewhere. Two figures locked together in a dance that started before we arrived and will still be going long after we are gone. There is nothing to resolve. There is nothing to worry about. It simply continues, in the dark, whether anyone is watching or not. Let's drift, now, toward the gentlest part of the whole night, softly, and spend some time with the actual argument he makes, and with the quiet answer that these stories have been offering back to it for the better part of a century. Because if we are going to spend an evening with a figure who says that nothing means anything, it seems only fair to sit with the reply. His case, stripped of the theatricality, comes down to something like this: that the order we live inside is a fiction we agreed to, that our morals and our meanings are things we invented and then forgot we invented, and that underneath them there is nothing but chaos and appetite, that anyone, given a bad enough day, would abandon every principle they hold and become exactly what he is, and that the only difference between him and everyone else is that he has stopped pretending. It is a bleak case, and it is put with real force because these stories give him the best possible version of it. They do not make him stupid, they let him be persuasive. And the answer these stories give is not a counter-argument, and that is the interesting part. Nobody ever out-debates him. Nobody produces a philosophical proof that meaning exists. That is not how it works, and it would not be convincing anyway, because you cannot reason someone out of a position they did not reason themselves into. The answer these stories give is not an argument at all. It is a demonstration. It is one person, quietly and at enormous cost, continuing to behave as though meaning exists, night after night, for decades, and thereby making it exist. Because that is the thing, and it is worth resting on gently, here in the warm dark. Meaning is not something you find lying about in the universe like a stone. It is not out there waiting to be discovered, and if you go looking for it in the cold structure of things, you will come back empty-handed and perhaps be tempted to conclude, as the laughing man has, that it isn't there. But that is the wrong place to look. Meaning is something people make. It is made in the choosing. It exists because someone decided to act as though it did, and kept deciding, and by deciding brought it into being. A promise means something because someone keeps it. Kindness means something because someone does it. The line between decency and cruelty is real not because it is written into the fabric of the cosmos, but because human beings draw it every day with their behavior, and go on drawing it even when it costs them. So when the man in the mask refuses to break, he is not proving the laughing man wrong in any abstract sense. He is doing something better. He is making the thing that was in question. Every night he goes out and protects someone, he is manufacturing, by hand, the very meaning whose existence was being denied. He is the answer, not because he has a better theory, but because he is doing it. And you cannot argue with someone who is simply doing the thing. You can only wait for them to stop. And he does not stop. There is something quietly beautiful in that, and it is a good thing to carry down with you towards sleep. Because the same is true, in smaller ways, of all of us. None of us can prove that anything matters. That is not a proof anyone has ever produced, and it probably is not the kind of thing that admits of proof. But every one of us, every day, makes things matter by treating them as though they do, by keeping our word, by being kind when it costs us something, by showing up for people who need us, by doing the small, unglamorous, decent things that nobody sees and nobody rewards. None of that is a philosophical argument. It is better than an argument. It is the thing itself. It is meaning being made, quietly, by hand, in 1,000 ordinary rooms, every single day, by people who are not thinking about philosophy at all and are simply trying to be decent. That is the answer to the laughing man, not a clever rebuttal, just people going on being kind in a world that offers them no guarantee that kindness is written into the structure of things, choosing it anyway, making it real by choosing it. He can say that nothing means anything as often and as persuasively as he likes, and every day, several billion people quietly disprove him without even noticing that they are doing it by getting up and looking after each other. And so his laughter, in the end, is not the last word. It is not even a very good word. It is just a loud one. Underneath it, steady and unglamorous and entirely undramatic, is the sound of everyone else simply going on, keeping their promises, tending to their people, doing their work, drawing their lines, and holding them. That sound is much quieter than laughter. It does not make for exciting stories, but it is the sound the world actually runs on, and it has been running on it for a very long time, and it will still be running on it long after the laughter has stopped echoing. Let's drift, now, softly, toward the people behind all of this, because we have spent the whole night talking about a figure who does not exist, and it seems right, before we let the story go, to spend a little time with the ones who do. Because every single thing we have talked about tonight was made by somebody. That is easy to lose sight of when a figure becomes as enormous as this one. He begins to feel like a natural feature of the world, like something that was always there. But he wasn't. Every element of him was invented by a person. Somebody decided on the white face. Somebody decided he should laugh. Somebody, in a hurry, on a deadline, decided he should survive his first story. Somebody, decades later, decided he should not remember his own past. Somebody wrote each of the thousands of stories he has appeared in. Somebody drew him, in every panel, 10,000 times over, each drawing a separate act of work by a separate human hand. And most of those people are not famous. A handful of names are known to the devoted, argued over, credited and disputed, because the question of who exactly created what, in an industry that kept poor records and treated its workers casually, has never been fully settled, and probably never will be. But behind the few known names, there are hundreds of others who left no mark at all. The letterers, the colorists, the inkers, the editors who made small, quiet decisions that turned out to matter enormously, the assistants who filled in backgrounds. Generations of working people, mostly unknown, doing their jobs, none of them imagining that the thing they were working on that afternoon would still be being retold a century later. There is something quite moving in that, and it is a gentle thing to rest on as the night deepens. That the great myths of our age were built this way, not by lone geniuses in towers, but by crowds of ordinary working people, mostly anonymous, contributing small pieces over long stretches of time. It is exactly how the old myths were built too, when you think about it. Nobody knows who invented the gods of the ancient world. They were made collectively, over centuries, by countless nameless tellers, each adding something, each changing something, until the figures that emerged belonged to everyone and no one. Our new myths were built the same way, just faster and with paychecks involved. But the pattern is identical. A crowd of hands, working over generations, producing something none of them could have produced alone. And there is a particular kind of craft in it that deserves quiet appreciation, and it is worth dwelling on softly. Because writing for a figure like this is a strange discipline. You inherit something you did not create, that has been shaped by dozens of hands before yours, that has a history you must respect but not be trapped by, and you must add something of your own without breaking what came before. It is like being handed a very old building and asked to add a room. You cannot simply do whatever you like, but you cannot merely copy what is there either, or the building never grows. The best tellers of these stories have found that balance, again and again, honoring what he is while making him newly their own. That is a real skill, and an underappreciated one, and the accumulated result of a century of people doing it well is the extraordinarily rich figure we have been drifting through tonight. Think, too, of how many of those people are gone now. The ones who made him in that room in the early 1940s have long since died. So have many of the ones who softened him in the 50s, and the ones who made him silly in the 60s, and a good number of the ones who darkened him again in the decades after that. Generation after generation of tellers have picked him up, done their work, handed him on, and departed. And he is still here. He has outlived everyone who has ever touched him, and he will outlive everyone touching him now. And the people who will tell his stories in 50 years have not been born yet. There is something both melancholy and rather lovely in that, and a good thought to drift on. The tellers pass. The tale remains. It is one of the oldest arrangements in human culture, and one of the only forms of continuity we have ever really managed. We do not last, but the things we make together and hand on and keep retelling can last a very long time indeed. Every person who added something to this figure put a small piece of themselves into something that outlived them, and that piece is still in there, somewhere, mixed in with all the others, being passed along to people who will never know their name. That is a modest kind of immortality, but it is a real one, and it is available in small ways to anyone who makes anything and hands it on. So when you picture him now, softly, as the night grows late, picture behind him the long crowd of people who made him, a century of writers and artists and editors and performers, most of them unknown, most of them gone, each one having held this strange, laughing figure for a little while and shaped him and passed him on. He is not really one thing. He is the accumulated work of all of them, layered up over decades like sediment, a figure made of the collective imagination of hundreds of people across 100 years. And that, more than anything he does in his stories, is what he actually is. Not a villain, a collaboration. An enormous, unplanned, century-long collaboration between people who mostly never met. Let's drift, softly, to one more place before we begin to let the night carry us down. To the great grim institution on the edge of the city, the place where the broken people of that world are kept, because it is one of the most atmospheric locations in all of these stories, and there is something strangely peaceful about it, viewed from a distance, in the dark. Picture it, an old building, far older than most of the city, sitting on high ground away from the lights, surrounded by grounds that were once formal gardens and are now mostly overgrown. Gothic stonework, tall, narrow windows, long corridors where the footsteps echo. It has the look of a place that was built with good intentions in some earlier century and has been slowly failing ever since, its purposes drifting, its hopeful founding ideals worn down by decades of a city that produces more damaged people than any institution could ever hold. And it is, in these stories, a deeply melancholy place. Not frightening exactly when you look at it properly. Sad, because it is where everyone the city has broken finally ends up. All those figures in their painted faces and strange costumes, the Riddler and the Man of Two Faces and the Frozen Man and all the rest, each one carrying some wound the city gave them, all eventually gathered here in the same old building, kept safe from the world, and the world kept safe from them, none of them getting much better. It is a warehouse for the consequences of a sick city, and the tragedy of it, the thing the stories return to again and again, is that it does not really work. People go in and they do not come out healed. They come out the same, or worse, or they do not come out at all. Let's rest in that sadness for a moment, softly, because it is worth acknowledging gently, and because there is something in it that reaches beyond the stories. Because the failure of that fictional institution is a shadow of a real and old and difficult problem, and the storytellers know it. What do we do with people who have been damaged into becoming dangerous? Where do we put them? How do we hold both truths at once, that they need care and that others need protection from them? These are genuinely hard questions that real people have wrestled with for centuries without arriving at good answers. And the great grim building on the hill is where these stories put that difficulty so they can look at it. It is not really a place. It is a question in the shape of a building, and the laughing man sits at the center of that question, the hardest case of all. And that is worth resting on gently. Because the institution's whole premise is that people can be understood and therefore helped. That if you can work out what happened to someone, you can begin to repair it. And he defeats that premise entirely. There is nothing to work out, no history to trace back to, no wound to treat. The people who try to help him, in story after story, find themselves reaching into an emptiness. And the stories often suggest that reaching in is dangerous, that the emptiness pulls at whoever looks into it too long. He is the patient who cannot be treated because there is no illness to name, only a shape where a person should be. But let's not stay in the sadness, because it is late now and the night is soft. Let's picture the place instead as it is between the stories, because that is a thing worth imagining, gently. Most of the time, in that great old building, nothing is happening at all. It is 3 a.m. in a fictional city, and the rain is coming down on the old slate roofs, and the long corridors are dark and empty, and everyone is asleep. Even him, presumably, somewhere in there, quiet at last, the way even the loudest people are quiet when they sleep. The building sits on its hill in the rain, holding its damaged population gently through the small hours, and the city below sleeps too, and nothing is happening anywhere, and the only sound is water on stone. There is something genuinely peaceful in that image, and it is a good place to rest as we come toward the end. All that chaos and all that noise and all that argument, and then the night comes and everything goes quiet, and even the most disordered figure in all of fiction is just a sleeping person in a dark room in an old building in the rain. The laughter stops eventually. It always does. Everything stops for the night in the end. even him. And the world, fictional and real alike, gets to rest. Let's begin now, softly, to draw the threads of this long story together, as the night grows deep and sleep draws near. Because we have traveled a long way tonight, and it is worth pausing, gently, to gather up what we have wandered through. We began in a crowded room in the early 1940s, with a few young creators on a deadline and a strange idea for a villain with a white face and a red grin. A figure who was very nearly killed off at the end of his first appearance, and who survived only because someone looked at him and thought, "No, keep that one." We followed him through the anxious 1950s, when a frightened industry softened him into a harmless prankster, and into the bright, silly 60s, when he became, of all things, a beloved figure of children's entertainment. We watched him darken again in the decades that followed, into the strange and unsettling figure most people recognize now. We looked into the hollow where his origin should be, and found several contradictory paths, and no way to choose between them. And we saw that the hollow was not an oversight, but the entire point. We traced his endless entanglement with the man in the mask, and found underneath it an old argument about what a person does with their suffering. We looked at the design of him, the fixed smile and the empty laughter, and found clever craft rather than magic. We asked why human beings keep telling stories about chaos, and found a very old family of tricksters stretching back through every culture we have. And we found, in the end, that these stories are not really about darkness winning. They are about darkness being answered, over and over, by someone who simply refuses to accept it. That is the shape of the whole thing, a question and an answer. He is the question, asked in the most persuasive and theatrical way anyone has ever managed. And the answer is not a clever reply, but a person, standing there, quietly declining to break, for 80 years and counting. And perhaps that is why he has lasted, and why we keep coming back to him. Not because we admire him, not because anyone wants what he wants, but because every generation has to face, in its own way, the possibility that things are meaningless and that decency is a pose. And it helps to have a place to put that thought. It helps to have a story where the thought is spoken aloud by someone brilliant and frightening, and then answered, and then the story ends and everyone goes to bed. We have been doing that for a very long time with figures like him, in every culture and every age. It seems to be one of the ways human beings keep themselves well. So let the story go now, gently, and let yourself drift the rest of the way down into sleep. The great dark city is quiet. The rain is still falling, soft and steady on the rooftops and the empty streets, catching the light of the street lamps and smearing it into long ribbons on the wet black roads. Up on its hill at the edge of the city, the old, grim building stands in the rain with its lights low, holding its damaged population gently through the small hours, everyone asleep, even the loudest of them, quiet at last. And out on the rooftops, wrapped in shadow, keeping his patient, endless watch over a city that will never quite be saved, the man in the mask stands exactly where he always stands, holding the line he has always held, ready for tomorrow. Nothing needs deciding tonight. No arguments need settling. The question and the answer have been circling each other for the better part of a century, and they will still be circling tomorrow, and the night after that, and long after all of us are gone. And there is nothing at all for you to do about any of it. It is a story. It is only ever a story. And it will keep telling itself in the dark, whether you are awake to follow it or not. You are safe. The doors are locked. The rain is falling somewhere far away on a city that does not exist. No one needs saving tonight, least of all you. You are allowed to let go. Sleep well, dreamer. The light in the high window is still burning. The watch is still being kept. The story will keep unspooling, quietly, in the dark. And that is exactly as it should be. And whenever you are ready, on whatever quiet night you find your way back here, we will drift through another story together, softly, in the dark. There is no hurry at all. There never is. Rest now. You are safe. Sleep well.